Hey guys, welcome to the Filming with Josh podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Milligan, and this is episode number 118, Sony Unveils the FX5.
This is the Filming with Josh podcast, brought to you by Rustic River Media. Welcome to the videographer's home for tips, tricks, and how to make flicks.
Thanks, y'all, for tuning in to another episode of the Filming with Josh podcast. If you are new to the podcast, Filming with Josh is a place where you can come and listen to all things video, whether it's current topics such as the new FX5 that got released today, or whether it's how to price your work, contract information, anything of the sort. We chat about it all on this podcast. There are 117 prior episodes to today's, so there are a lot of episodes to go through. So feel free to jump through and look around and see what you can find that might pique your interest. And yeah, if you are new, also, I would love for you to go over to Facebook and search for Filming with Josh. That is a private Facebook group where you can ask to join and I will approve it as soon as I see your request. And there we chat more about video. I post behind the scenes pictures or videos of things I'm working on, chat about certain topics. People can share their work, ask for feedback and things of that nature, all on that Facebook group. So thanks guys for listening to Filming with Josh. I'm glad that you're here today. Please note that this is going to be a little bit of a longer episode. The reason for that is that I'm wanting to provide context for my thoughts. I'm going to start by briefly explaining a little bit about my background as well as the work I do today so you can kind of understand my perspective on these cameras and how I see them. Also, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the history of Sony's FX/FS line to help provide even more context about where this camera is positioned and what we can expect to come next. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the FS7, the FS7 II, and kind of what happened when those cameras came out, what some of their limitations were, and then how from there we got the FX9, why in my opinion that was a little bit of a disappointment, but then we got the A7S III and the FX6, and what transpired after that. And that way you have context on kind of me and my perspective and where that's coming from, as well as some context on what Sony has done in the past to lead up to the FX5. That also will help us dictate what we can expect Sony to do next. So there's a lot of context being provided here, hence the little bit longer podcast, so feel free to skip ahead if you don't want to listen to some of the backstory. Earlier today, Sony announced the FX5, and I want to go ahead and say I have never seen this camera in person. I have not handled it, so I'm just giving you my thoughts on it. And my thoughts are coming from someone who owns and operates an FX6, FX3 combo as my primary cameras for video, and then I also have an A1 and an A1 Mark II. I've been a long-time Sony shooter. I've been shooting with Sony professionally for about 15 years now. I've been with Sony since the A-mount days, back when they acquired Minolta and started coming out with Minolta-inspired A-mount lenses and cameras, and was with them when they came out with the original A7S, and I switched over to E-mount at that time. I've owned a ton of Sony E-mount mirrorless cameras over the years, as well as an FS7, FS7 Mark II, and FX6. So that's kind of my experience with the brand. So in saying that, anything I talk about today is going to come from my experience as a Sony user. Now, if you are new to this podcast, a little about me. I own Rustic River Media. We just celebrated our 11th year of being in business as of this July, but I have been doing video longer than that. I started a company under a different name back when I was in college, and then took 2 years to work in outdoor television on the Sportsman, Pursuit, and Outdoor channels, and then started my company in 2015 and have been running it the last 11 years. So I've been doing video professionally for a while. My business today is primarily video focused, along with live streaming, although we do offer photography. But most of my work is going to be commercial, corporate, We do a lot of event coverage. We do a lot of stuff in the political sphere. I still work in the outdoor television space from time to time and do a lot of marketing content for hunting ranches and fly fishing shops and things like that. Do a ton of branded content, shoot some doc stuff here and there, and do a lot of live streaming all kinds of different things, whether it's sporting events or corporate projects, speaking engagements, things like that. And then the photography we do kind of goes alongside all of that when we get asked to handle both mediums of video and stills. We will take on those projects as well and offer photography specifically for those reasons. Helps us get more projects. But that's a little bit about me, and I want to say that because I want you to understand my perspective, because I am just one person. I own one company. You might be someone who specializes in something completely different. You might do weddings. You might do real estate. You might do your own YouTube series. I don't know what you do, but this is what I do. And so my thoughts on the FX5 are going to come from someone who does a lot of commercial, a lot of corporate, a lot of event coverage, a lot of political stuff, who dabbles in documentary, who still does some television, and does a lot of live streaming. That's the perspective of which I'm going to talk on this on. With that out of the way, let's talk about this camera. To talk about this camera, I feel like we need to give this camera some context as well. You see, years ago, the FS7 came out, and there's a reason why I'm going to talk about this camera. So it came out when I was still in college. I was at the tail end of college, and at that time, I was saving up for an FS700. That was a camera I really wanted. Couldn't afford it. I was a broke college student, so I was saving up for it or was trying to find a way to finance it. And then around 2014, Sony came out with the FS7. I ended up getting mine not when it first came out. I ended up getting it in 2016 and took that camera with me literally all over the world and shot all kinds of projects with it. It was great. But there were some things about that camera that drove me nuts. For example, that camera didn't have the best color science in the world. Sony back then kind of struggled with that, and the FS7 was no exception. And one of the challenges with that camera is to get somewhat decent color out of it, you needed to be able to shoot an S-Log3 S-Gamut 3.Cine. It's the latter part of that that's important, S-Gamut 3.Cine, because that helped dictate how that camera interpreted color. Well, on the FS7, to shoot S-Log3 S-Gamut 3.Cine, you had to be in Cine EI mode, which is no problem. I like Cine EI mode. I work in that on my FX6 today. I work in that on my FX3. I like Cine EI mode. It's just a way of rating your exposure for post, but it also helps you to stick with certain base ISOs, which is a good workflow to be in, and I like that. But the problem on the FS7 was that Cine EI mode was the only way to shoot S-Gamut 3.Cine, which is not a problem in and of itself. The problem was that Cine EI back then was extremely limited. If you'd never had any experience with the FS7, you are locked into 3 white balance settings in Cine EI mode: 3200, 4300, or 5500. You literally could not have any other white balance settings outside of that. You couldn't manually dial it in. You couldn't do a custom white balance. You literally had 3200, 4300, or 5500. And that was it. That drove me absolutely nuts. Same was true with base ISOs. Back then, that camera only had one base ISO, and that was a base ISO of 2000. You could not alter the ISO in any way, shape, or form. You could change the way you rate it, which is what exposure index or EI, Cine EI mode is all about, but you could not physically change the base ISO. You could only ever shoot in 2000. A lot of times, in bright lighting, if you wanted to shoot with fast glass, even with built-in ND, the ISO base of 2000 was so bright that you still had to add external ND in order to shoot fast glass wide open in bright daylight. So it was too bright for a lot of situations. But the reverse was also true. You'd go out and work with that camera in like a dock setting, and maybe you would want to have a higher ISO, and you didn't have that option because you were stuck at 2000. So the only way around those problems was to drop to custom mode, which sounds great in theory because you can have whatever ISO you want, you can have whatever white balance you want, but now you lose S-Gamut 3.Cine and you're shooting in a worse color profile. Drove me bonkers. But people like me made a living off that camera for years. I had the FS7 for 2.5 or 3 years. It got damaged on a shoot I was doing. Rather than get it fixed, I ended up replacing it with an FS7 Mark II, and I ran the FS7 Mark II for another like 2.5 plus years. So collectively, I ran the FS7 series for about 5 years and made it work. It made a lot of money for me. It was a very popular camera. I got hired because I had that camera, but there were just things, as mentioned, about it that kind of drove me crazy. There were some other things too I wasn't crazy about on that camera, but those were really the things that drove me the most insane. Well, in 2020, right around when COVID's happening, Sony comes out with the FX9. In fact, I'm going to fact check myself here because I think it might have been the end of 2019. Let's see. When did Sony release the FX9? It might have been the end of 2019. Yep, it was. It was September 13th, 2019, 5 years after the release of the FS7. That camera, to be honest, when it got announced, I was a little annoyed by it. Reason being is Sony had done some things right. For example, they fixed the color. I'll never forget, I could still see it in my head, when Sony came out with the FX9, and one of the first videos I saw, an individual had gone to a Sony event, was asked to come and get hands-on with this camera, and so he released this video the day the FX9 came out, and it was just this handheld video that he made, all with natural lighting. He only had like an hour or two with the camera, and so he wrote like a little script out really fast, had this dancer who was wearing, I can still remember this, he was wearing a Colts uniform, and he followed this dancer around and shot a lot of handheld footage of this dancer dancing, and he wrote this script for this dancer and had the dancer VO it with a cell phone, which the VO sounded really good. He did a great job of EQing it and making it sound really good for being recorded on a phone. Cut it to some music, had some nice quick cuts to it, and released it online, all shot on S-Cinetone, which was obviously a Rec 709 profile, but it demonstrated how significant the difference in color was on this camera versus previous generations. And also the detail. The FS7 was a 4K camera, but it was kind of soft. The FX9 had a ton of detail because it had a 6K sensor and was downsampling that to 4K. So immediately when I saw this guy's video, the first thing that popped out to me was that color looks amazing, and there's a ton of detail here. Plus there was a better depth of field presence if you were wanting a shallow depth of field because it was full frame. Not that shallow depth of field is the best for every situation, but if you want it, it's there. It looked great. And I remember being blown away by that. I'm like, dude, this is S-Cinetone, like straight out of camera Rec 709 color. It truly floored me. And I don't shoot in S-Cinetone super often today. I shoot in primarily S-Log3, except for when I'm live streaming or if I'm getting hired by another company and they specifically ask for it, which has happened. Most of the time I'm shooting in S-Log3, but it just, the fact that he could get such good color from a Rec 709 profile just demonstrated the advancements that Sony had made in their color retention. And you could tell this originally when they came out with the first Venice, but we weren't really seeing that a whole lot yet in the FS or FX line. They touted the FS5 Mark II as having better color, but to be honest, I didn't really see it. But the FX9 absolutely did. I was blown away. And it was, you look at it and you're like, okay, if this is what S-Cinetone looks like, what is S-Log3 S-Gamut 3 gonna S-Gamut 3.Cine gonna look like now? Because it's gonna be able to interpret colors so much better, and it did. And so this camera, had a full frame sensor. It had autofocus. It had 4 audio dials instead of 2, making controlling all 4 channels easier. It had a high resolution sensor, even though it was only shooting to 4K, it at least looked good, or had a lot of detail because it was downsampled, and it had really great color. What then were the problems? Why was I frustrated? Well, it didn't fix a lot of the things or address a lot of the things that you would have thought would have been addressed after 5 years. After 5 years, you would have thought this camera would have had a bump in frame rates. It did not. It still was capped at the same 4K 60 as the FS7 was that came out in 2014. It also, not only was it capped at still at 4K 60, it still had to be in Super 35 mode to shoot 4K 60. So there really wasn't much of a jump there. Plus, while it could do RAW out, just like the FS7, you had to have that extension unit in order to do it. And that was really frustrating. It's like, dude, you had to have the extension unit for the FS7. You did not for the FS5, which came out later. You would have thought the FX9 would be more like the 5, but it wasn't. It was built on the same architecture as the FS7, which was so annoying. And so you had to have the extension unit. You had issues with rolling shutter. Not the worst rolling shutter camera in the world, but it definitely was there. And no bump in frame rates, no bump in resolution. And so people like me who were running the FS7 looked at this like, yeah, I mean, it's an upgrade, but it's just not as much of an upgrade as we were hoping to get. So I did not buy that camera. I held off. Well, a little bit of time goes by, and about a year later, during COVID, Sony announces the a7S III. The a7S III, when it got announced, I immediately knew I wanted it. I had an S1, I had an S2, I had a lot of experience with those cameras. I definitely wanted to get an S3, and it, to me, was a very appealing camera because it had dual base ISO. You had, at that time, it was, I think, 640, if I remember correctly, was the low base. And then you had 12,800 as the high base. There still was a little bit of a difference there. Like 12.8 is not as clean as the low base, but it was clean for being 12.8. So you had this great usable range of ISOs. You had the same color that was introduced in the FX9 is now right here in the a7S III. You had crazy good autofocus, a much improved body with a flip out rotating screen. You had the addition of the CF Express Type A card slots, and it had 2 of them, but it was also backwards compatible to dual SD, right? So many great things. I got, for the A7S series, it was new to have this, but you finally had XAVC I 10-bit, which was not present in previous Sony Alpha cameras. I mean, just in so many ways, this camera was a massive leap for Sony, and it just exploded, man. There were so many people who went out and bought this camera. I mean, really, the only camera that could rival it was Canon's original R5, which had a ton of trouble with overheating, and obviously was a different camera because that had a much higher resolution and was much more photocentric, but it was really the only camera that had some really nice usable video features in a full-frame mirrorless body until the a7S III came out. And when it came out, like, there was nothing else like it. Now, when it came out, I bought one right away. And I was in the middle of working on this big commercial project for this new corporate company I had landed. And it was one of my biggest clients at the time that I'd ever landed. And I still had the FS7, and the FS7 was my A cam. And so I got the a7S III. And what was so funny was that the image was so much better on the a7S III than the FS7 that even though the FS7 was my A cam, I only used it for a few shots in the brand project I made, the brand film I made for this corporate company, because the a7S III looked so much better. And it felt weird, right? Like I'm showing up for this big project and I'm rocking this photo-looking camera. But the image quality was better. It was better. It was smoked the FS7. So much better. And I could not wait for Sony to come out with something similar in image quality and sensor type, but in a more video-centric body. And that's when Sony comes out with the FX6. And I bought one in 2021 and sold my FS7, and I was so excited. I had an a7S III and I had an FX3. They shared the same sensor. They had similar codec options. They had very similar color. I mean, it was awesome. And I rocked that for a while until Sony came out with the FX3, and I traded out the S3 for an FX3, and it was a worthwhile trade. I did miss the EVF, and I also didn't like the fact that the joystick was on top of the camera. To me, that's a little awkward. I still would like the joystick to be in the back of the camera. But outside of that, the FX3 was a really great addition for Sony because it took everything I liked about the a7S III, but gave it a cooling fan, which, to be fair, I never had the a7S III overheat. I live in Texas. I've had other cameras from Sony overheat, but not that one. But you had a cooling fan, which meant it was even less likely to overheat on you. You got, the screw mounts on top of the body, making it easier to mount in a cage, which I pretty much leave mine in a cage unless I'm using it on a gimbal. You also got... compared to the a7S III, you eventually got like shutter angle, and you got Cine EI mode. They changed the base ISO from 640 to 800 so that it would more closely match the FX6, so you could have a streamlined workflow of low base and high base matching. and you got tally lights and stuff like that. And so I bought one and sold the A7S III. And I've been running the FX3 alongside the FX6 for a long time now, and I have made a lot of money off of those cameras. And as mentioned earlier, I have an A1 and an A1 Mark II, and I use those for photography. I also use them as extra cameras for my video work. Just last week, for example, I had 3 days of interviewing married couples for this project I'm working on. And for all 3 shoots, I ran an FX6A, FX3B, and A1 Mark IIc. That way I could have like a master wide of the married couple and then have tights of each person on the 2 extra cameras. And they all cut together very well. The Sony system has been really polished for a long time now, and their lenses are great. I like their zooms. I like their primes. If you've listened to one of my previous episodes that came out a few weeks back, you heard me talk about my switch to the 28 to 70 f2 and 50 to 150 f2 and how much I love those lenses. I recently picked up the 100 400 4.5 when it got announced. I love that lens. I mean, Sony's killing it right now. They got some great lenses and they have some great cameras. And if you're in the Sony system and you've been in the Sony system like I've been, you know that this is a solid system to be in, because there are a lot of other people out there who shoot on Sony. And the positive of that is it means when you hire other people, it's really easy to find either owner-operators that can come and you can slot them into your work with you, and everybody kind of matches in workflow and color. Or if they're going to operate your equipment and you're just looking for an operator, they more than likely have experience running Sony, so they'll know how to use your gear. Plus, the opposite is true, right? You might get hired because you have Sony gear because someone is also looking for a Sony shooter. I mean, being in a brand that's really popular like that opens up a lot of doors for either landing jobs or making it easier to find people to come work on your projects with you. Plus the fact Sony's got such a great lens ecosystem. I don't think they necessarily have the best lens in every category. I think that Nikon has some lens offerings that I wish Sony had, and Canon has some lens offerings that I wish Sony had, but the same is true that Sony has a lot of lenses that neither of those companies have. So it's a solid ecosystem. It's been around for a while. You can trust it. Their gear is reliable. I like the Sony system, and I'm happy to be in the Sony system. So where does the FX5 land in all of this? And why did I give you that huge backstory on the FS7 and A7S III and all that? Well, I gave you that backstory because I wanted to give you context on where I think the FX5 sits today and what I think this means for the future of Sony. When you look at the camera landscape out there, Sony has been one of the leaders in video for a long time. Not even necessarily talking about their gear, but just in terms of, as mentioned earlier, how many people utilize their equipment. Now, it does matter or what sector of the market you're in, right? Because if you're at the highest end of the highest end and you're working on really big budget documentaries, feature films, commercials, you're probably going to run across or are using yourself some flavor of an Arri camera. But under that is Sony. Sony with the Venice and Venice 2 are also very popular at the high end. Then just under that, you've got the Burano, which is kind of the first camera that starts to fall into the owner-operator category for Sony. I'm not saying there aren't people out there that don't own Venices, because there are. I actually know some people that own a Venice or Venice 2. But most people are looking at the Burano and down. And you have the Burano, the now discontinued FX9, FX6, FX3, FX2, FX30, A1 Mark II, A1, the list goes on and on. And so from that point of view, you've got this company that has all of these products, and these products are extremely popular in the high end, like our Arri, just sitting just underneath them. And then also, and probably are the most popular everywhere else in every other segment of the market. Yes, Reds are out there and are being used every day. So is Canon, so is Nikon, so are Blackmagics and all the other brands. But if we're being honest, Sony is definitely the most popular in almost every category outside of the highest end of the highest end, where Arri still reigns king. So in saying that, when you look at the market, Sony already had such a lead in the market that they really didn't have to rush the release of a new camera. And if you look at Sony historically, and again, we're going to go back to me giving some context here, Sony has historically gone 5 or 6 years without updating camera models. 5 years is actually quite common for them. I can't remember exactly when the FX3 came out. Let's look this up. I think it was 21. Yep, here it is. February 23rd of 2021. Available to purchase in March of 21. So they make sense. It tracks. Here we are. 5 years later, as mentioned, you had the FS7. 5 years later, you had the 9. You had the A7S 2, and then 5 years later you got the A7S 3. Now we had the FX3, and 5 years later you have the FX5. So Sony is right on time. This is what they do. They wait 5 years on a lot of their camera models. Maybe not as much their alpha models, but when it comes to their cinema division, particularly the FX or FS division, FS isn't really a thing anymore, but those cameras tend to have about a 5-year gap. And so Sony is right on time with this camera. They don't tend, from what I see, to be too influenced by the market. They kind of do their own thing. Now, there are some features that are in this camera that might suggest that they were somewhat influenced by the market, and we'll get to that in a minute. But in terms of camera releases, they didn't rush anything. They weren't worried about it. This is what they do. They come out with cameras in this lineup around every 5 years or so. The FX9 is beyond that at this point. It was discontinued and we haven't seen a replacement for that. But Sony, in my mind, is right on track. So them coming out with this camera, to me, makes a lot of sense. And when you look at the market, look at like Canon, for example. Canon has come out over the last 2-3 years with some very compelling cameras. You had the C400, the C80, you had the couple of new cameras. Is it the C50? I'm having to do a lot of Googling today, but there's so many models out there. It's you got the C50, which came out. I didn't want to say that wrong, which was a competitor to the FX3. They just came out with another one. I don't even remember what that one's called. But you get the point. Like, Canon has come out with some really nice cameras over the past 2 or 3 years that are very compelling cameras. And you could make an argument that they outspec the comparable Sony cameras, as they should. They were several years newer. Remember, Sony's on this like 5-year chapter. Like, they come out with cameras every 5 years. A lot of these cameras, like the C50, just recently came out. It should absolutely have better specs than the FX3. If it didn't, that would be a bad thing. That wouldn't make sense. So yeah, of course, there are other models out there that you could argue have features that the Sony cameras don't have, as they should. But here we are, 5 years later, the FX5 is released, and it kind of showcases how good Sony is at video, because they came out with features in these cameras that don't just catch them up with the video market, like with what Canon has recently come out with, but instead just blows them away, in my opinion. Now, this is my opinion, and I'm not dogging a camera brand. I'm not trying to dog any camera brands out there. But when I look at the FX5 and where it sits in the market compared to other similar camera models from other brands, I think that this is one of the most well-rounded cameras you can buy today at that price point and with that form factor. Obviously, there are different cameras like the Burano that are in a completely different segment of the market, or even the FX6, which is aimed at a different segment of the market. But when you look at the FX5 and what it is targeted at, I think in that realm, it is a very compelling, if not the most compelling option. Let's see what all it has, right? So going off of everything that has been announced today, you've got 5K, which I think is a really great sweet spot. I shoot 8K on the A1 and A1 Mark II purely from the standpoint that when you shoot in full frame 4K, it is either line skipped or pixel bend, one or the other, which most of the time doesn't really matter. But if you have a lot of fine repeating patterns, you could see aliasing or moire pop up every once in a while. So when possible, I tend to shoot on 8K on those cameras. But 8K can be a bit overkill sometimes. It looks great and gives you some post-crop flexibility, but I do think that there are some other resolutions out there that might be more compelling to use on a day-to-day basis. 5K is kind of the sweet spot. You're getting a little bit more detail than on a standard 4K image. You get a little bit more ability to crop in on the image and post if you want, but you're also not shooting at such a high resolution that you're killing your computer performance. You're stacking up a ton of hard drives. And at the same time, it also means that you're working with a sensor that can handle rolling shutter a lot better. Because typically when a camera, I say typically because this isn't always the case, but typically a higher resolution camera tends to struggle more with rolling shutter. A caveat to that would be like the A1 and A1 Mark II. They are 50 megapixel cameras that can shoot 8K internally, and they also have really great rolling shutter performance thanks to their stacked sensor design. But most cameras that come out with high resolution tend to struggle with rolling shutter. Sony coming out with this camera with 5K seems to have hit the sweet spot of giving us a bump in resolution, but while maintaining great rolling shutter performance. And the FX3 was known, so is the A7S III, so is the FX6, for having good rolling shutter performance. It doesn't look like Sony took really a step backwards here. We retain good rolling shutter performance, but with a bump in resolution. Along with that, we get Super 35 4K options. This is a big deal to me because I really like having Super 35 4K in the A1 and A1 Mark II. Previous Sony cameras I had back from the older versions, like when we had like the A7R3 and A7R2, I'm going back a couple generations here. Those cameras also had a Super 35 4K mode, and I use those a lot, right? Because it unlocks some things. It unlocks the ability to shoot 4K with Super 35 glass. It also unlocks the ability for you to crop in on your full frame glass to get a little bit more reach. A particular situation that I use that a lot in is for filming wildlife. I have a 100-400 4.5 in my office. I have had other long lenses before that one, and I do film a lot of wildlife content, particularly when doing marketing for hunting outfits. And Super 35 4K in the A1 and A1 Mark II is extremely useful. Well, we get that with this camera. So we've got the 5K, we've got Super 35 4K, and then we've got oversample full frame 4K options. We have a lot of frame rate options. You will be able to, at some point, shoot 4K 240 on this camera with a future firmware update. That is really cool. Is that something I'm going to use every day? No, it is not. Is it something that I will use from time to time? It is. That is something I will use from time to time. Having that ability is fantastic. You also have 5K 120. So it takes the 4K 120. Now we've got 5K 120. So you got 5K 120, 4K 240. That's amazing. Then you have and I said earlier, there might be some things that might be influenced from the market, and one of those things is OpenGate, and we now have that. I think that's influenced from the market because Sony has said previously, I've heard Sony reps say it themselves on YouTube videos where they were being interviewed, that they didn't think OpenGate was that big of a thing. They felt like it was kind of a niche thing, but I think the market told them otherwise, and they responded, and now we have OpenGate. And we didn't just get OpenGate, but there's a lot of OpenGate options on this camera, more so than most cameras that have OpenGate. In fact, some cameras from some brands that have OpenGate, to me, it's so restricting on when you can use it that it makes it kind of more of a gimmick. Not that it is a gimmick, but you lose access to so many frame rate and resolution options. OpenGate on the FX5, however, has a lot of frame rate and resolution options. And so you can utilize OpenGate in a way that doesn't make it feel like a gimmick, like it was an afterthought. Like it feels like this camera was built around the idea of being able to use OpenGate on a regular basis. Now, OpenGate to me isn't the biggest thing. This is just me personally. It all depends on what kind of work you do. But most of the time, I'm shooting horizontal and I'm delivering horizontal. When I am shooting vertical, it's for one of those social media retainer accounts I mentioned earlier in the podcast. And I know going into the shoot, I'm going to shoot vertical. So I shoot vertical from the gate. Only every once in a while do I find myself in a situation where I'm on a project where I might need to have delivery of both formats. In those scenarios, OpenGate will be nice to have, but I've made it work without it up to this point. So to me, that's not like a deal breaker whether it had it or it didn't, but it does have it, and it doesn't feel like a gimmick, which is great. But let's talk about the most exciting feature to me, and that is X-OCN. When Sony came out with the Venice and Venice 2, they debuted X-OCN. Sony has had other RAW formats in the past, but X-OCN was like their more modern version of a compressed RAW format. It was beautiful, and it was used on a lot of movies you've watched, like Top Gun 2. Looks great. Helps you to maximize the potential of the dynamic range of the camera. It helps you to have better control over color and post. It's a great feature to have. You can change settings after the fact. It's a really great format. And when the Burano came out, the Burano did not get the same flavor of X-OCN that you found in the Venice and Venice 2. The Burano, to have X-OCN, it could do it internally, but it could only do it in X-OCN LT or X-OCN Lite. I call it Lite. I'm not sure it's what LT stands for, but the point of X-OCN LT is that it is an even further compressed version of their X-OCN RAW files, but it still looks great, and it is still a flavor of RAW. It's just a little bit more compressed than what you see on the Venice or Venice 2. The FX5 is the first Sony camera under the Burano price point to have internal RAW, and they did give it X-OCN LT, just like what the Burano has. So it's not the same flavor of X-OCN that you'd find in the Venice and Venice 2, although I think the Venice and Venice 2 do have X-OCN LT, but they also have higher end versions of X-OCN that have higher bit rates. This is the same as what you're going to find in the Burano, but the fact that Sony gave it to the FX5 is spectacular because it's 16-bit. This is a 16-bit internal compressed RAW file with manageable file sizes. Why is that so important? Well, let's look at the rest of the market. You have Arri, which has internal RAW. You have Red, which has internal RAW. You have Blackmagic, who's had internal RAW for a long time now. You have Canon, who started working with internal RAW back with the C200 and then started debuting at some of their mirrorless cameras and some of their other cameras that have come out in their C series since then. You have Panasonic even, who is now starting to offer internal RAW on some of their cameras. And then, of course, you have Nikon with their NRAW, and now Nikon owns Red, and they're starting to come out with some other flavors of RAW that kind of merge the two brands together. But when you look at the marketplace, basically every brand, for the most part, or all the major brands, are offering internal RAW of some sort outside of Sony. Even some of the other brands not mentioned there, some of the like Kinefinities and things, have had some sort of internal RAW before. But Sony has not really allowed for internal RAW. With Sony, you could have recorded RAW on the F5 and F55, and that was actual 16-bit RAW, but you had to have an extension unit and these certain types of cards to do it. It's very expensive, and it made the cameras massive, like they look like bazookas. Or you've been able to do like ProRes RAW, which is a 12-bit RAW file, through a recorder. But the only way to really get a modern Sony camera with RAW today, up until the FX5, was with the Venice, Venice 2, or Burano, which means with Sony, if you wanted internal RAW, you had to spend $25,000 and buy a Burano, or spend more and get a Venice or Venice 2. And Sony seems to have not cared about that, because they keep coming out with camera models that could do some sort of XAVC-I 4K or even XAVC HS 8K in terms of like the A1 Mark II, but they have continuously avoided giving RAW, internal RAW, to their camera models despite the whole rest of the market offering it. But they not only fixed that with the FX5, but they surpassed the vast majority of the market in terms of the offering of RAW that they give, because it's 16-bit. Even though it's an LT or lighter version of X-OCN, it's the same codec you find in the Burano, which is an incredible camera. So you're getting the same internal 16-bit RAW file that you have in the Burano, but you're getting it in a sub $5,000 essentially glorified mirrorless camera, right? I mean, this camera doesn't shoot photos, so it's not really a hybrid camera, but it's very similar to the FX3, and it now has a 16-bit RAW file type. When you look at that compared to Canon, for example, Canon's internal RAW on all of their cameras is 12-bit. When you look at Blackmagic, same thing. When you look at Panasonic, same thing. When you look at Nikon, same thing. The only way to get internal 16-bit RAW is to either go with Arri, which you're paying out the nose for, or with Red with their R3D files. The cheapest way to get 16-bit RAW is to buy into the Komodo line from Red, but that's a Super 35 camera. Whether you get the Komodo or the Komodo X or whichever version you get, those are sub 10 grand. Some of them are now sub 3 grand, but they do give you a 16-bit RAW R3D file, which is obviously a really great version of RAW, and they have different flavors of compression. Fantastic cameras with fantastic codecs, and if you get the Komodo line, you get a global shutter sensor, but it is Super 35, and you are going to lack a lot of modern features that a lot of people like myself enjoy having, like autofocus, which, hey, it is what it is. It's a useful tool. Or having internal audio inputs, internal NDs. Of course, there are some Reds that do have things like that, but those are substantially more expensive. But the point is outside of Red, the only way to get a 16-bit RAW file before today was to go with Arri or to go with Sony's Venice 2, or Burano. There's really never been another camera outside of those to offer an internal 16-bit RAW that I know of. And I'm saying that because maybe there's a camera out there that I don't know of. Maybe one of the Ken Infinities because they did have some early versions that had some sort of RAW that got taken away because of Red's patent and all this stuff. So maybe at some point, sometime, that did exist. I do remember Blackmagic used to have a different RAW format that same thing because of the patent issues or patent conflict. They ended up having to get rid of their original internal RAW format. Maybe that was 16-bit. I don't know. But if I'm looking at the modern landscape, it's all internal 12-bit outside of the Venice 2, Burano from Sony, or going with Arri or Red. So for Sony to debut a sub $5,000 souped up FX3 style camera in an FX5 and give it X-OCN 16-bit RAW internal immediately puts it above every other brand in the market outside of Red. And I'm not counting Arri here because that's a totally different market than the FX5, right? So to me, that's why this is a big deal. More so than 5K, more so than OpenGate. It has triple base ISO, which is great. It's a useful tool. I don't think it's the end of the world that the FX3 or FX6 don't have it. I can't say that there's been too terribly many times I've found myself in a situation where I felt like I couldn't do a shoot because I didn't have that third base ISO. But it's a useful tool, right? You know, instead of going to 12.8 and adding ND when you need to bump in light, you can just go to 4,000. That's a useful tool. But while that is cool, while OpenGate is cool, while 5K is cool, while all the frame rate bumps are cool, to me, the biggest thing that this camera offers is 16-bit X-OCN LT. And I think that makes this an extremely compelling camera in the sub $10,000 marketplace. Because in my mind, if you want to drop $5,000 to $10,000 and you want to have a really robust codec that you can push and pull and post, you're either going to go with some sort of a Red Komodo, or now you can go with the FX5. And with the FX5, you're getting a lot of features that are very useful for people like myself who are working with smaller crews, a lot of times might be taking on projects by themselves, and need to have the flexibility of having built-in audio inputs with the top handle. I don't use the built-in audio inputs on the FX3. I've never even put the top handle in the FX3. I use the FX6, or I'll send audio to a separate recorder. But if you're someone who doesn't have an FX6 or doesn't want to use a recorder, having audio inputs on a camera that can also do 16-bit RAW internal is awesome. Having IBIS on a camera that can do 16-bit RAW is awesome. Having triple base ISO and autofocus capabilities in a camera that also has 16-bit RAW is awesome. It's just really cool to have all the capabilities of modern cameras like the FX3 and being able to take that and give it now a 16-bit RAW option. And I'm very intrigued by that. I'm even more intrigued about what this means for the future of Sony FX cameras, but we'll get to that in a minute. So going back to the FX5, not only does it have the internal X-OCN RAW options and the open gate and the bump in resolution and frame rates and all the things we've talked about in the triple base ISO, etc. But another thing that it has that I think is really interesting is the ability to remove IBIS. Now, you have to pay to have this done from my understanding, but it is an option that you can get from Sony. Now, you may be listening to this podcast and be wondering, why on earth would you want to remove IBIS? Well, if you're wanting to mount this camera to a car, to a drone, to anything where there's going to be a lot of fast-paced movement or harsh movement, you do not want IBIS. I've seen this before firsthand where I have mounted cameras with IBIS on a car mount, and just a simple driving shot down a gravel road overwhelmed the IBIS to the point where the IBIS is now flopping around. Even if you have IBIS turned off, it's still not bolted to the sensor's still not bolted down. It's just clicked off. So whenever you're driving down the road and the road's like rocky, for example, and there's a lot of micro bumps, having a sensor that's not bolted down causes it to flop around. You can also see this on drone shots. If you've ever seen a drone video that was captured with a camera like an FX3, because the FX3 has IBIS, the harsh maneuvers of the drone can cause the sensor to flop around because it's not bolted down and it's not strong enough to overcome those movements. And so it creates issues. I have long also said that I'm a fan of shooting handheld without IBIS. Now, if you're shooting with a lightweight rig, IBIS is really useful, but I prefer to shoot handheld on my FX6, which is heavier. I've got a V-mount battery on it. I do have a V-mount on my FX3 as well, unless I'm running it on a gimbal, but I can run an even bigger V-mount on my FX6 because it can balance it better. I've got a small HD monitor. I've got a Sennheiser MKH8060 gun mic in the mic mount, an aftermarket mic mount that's on the camera. I'm running a 28-70, for example, lens up front, and I'll take that kind of hefty rig and I'll run it on either a Cine saddle or an Easy Rig, and the handheld movement, while not as quote-unquote stable as IBIS, it feels a lot more natural. When you have IBIS on a smaller mirrorless type camera, you tend to get that kind of floaty feeling that IBIS has, where you're always watching it kind of settle into place. Or it will try to correct for movement you don't necessarily want it to correct for. Like, hey, I'm going to move to the right here, and IBIS is like jerking in the other way, thinking it needs to correct you, when in all reality, you were intending for that maneuver. And so when I shoot handheld, I actually prefer the FX6 because it feels more organic. Well, on the FX3, you can turn IBIS off, so that's fine. If you want to shoot like that, you can. But if you want to mount it to a car or a drone or anything like that, it's not going to be bolted down. Bolting it down would be the better option. You can't do that. So if you mount it to one of those devices, you're SOL. So Sony offering a service where it's like, hey, if you're going to be using this in a professional application where you're going to be mounting it to maybe a drone, or maybe you're going to mount it to a car rig of some sort, or you're going to be shooting a ton of handheld and you don't really care for the IBIS, send it to us and we'll remove it. I've never heard of that before. I don't know of any other brand that's ever offered anything like that, but it shows you where Sony's head is at with this camera. The fact that they gave this camera a little bit beefier body in the FX3, it's got the mounting points, it's got all the tally lights, all the thing the FX3 has, just a little bit beefed up, but then also gave it X-OCN LT and the ability to send it in and get the IBIS removed. Sony clearly intends for this camera to be used not just in the video market, but in the cinema market. They expect this camera to be used on commercials. They expect it to be used in docs. They expect it to probably be used in feature films, particularly when wanting to mount it to things like car rigs and drones. So you can tell where Sony's head's at. They see the potential of this camera. And that to me makes me really excited about it, because I'm not necessarily saying I'm going to send mine off and get the IBIS removed. I don't have a drone that is capable of flying a camera like this. And while I have mounted cameras to cars, I don't do that every day. So I may not pay for that service to be done, but I love the fact that I'm investing in a camera that could have that done to it. And in a camera that was designed from the manufacturer with the intention of it obviously being used in really polished commercial or theatrical productions. Same is true with things like the Big 6 menu system, the fact that it operates with no photo capabilities at all, and the entire menu structure, instead of being an alpha menu like on the FX3, it's now the same menu system as like the FX6. That just shows you, again, where their head is at. They even gave it a different type of a dial for going through the menus and things. And it's more similar to what you'd find on one of their FX or Cine Alta cameras. Again, it's showing you where their head is at. This is not a photo camera. This is not a hybrid camera. This is not a camera designed for anything other than being used in professional video work. And that is why they gave it X-OCN LT. It's why they gave you the ability to have IBIS removed. It's why they gave you open gate recording and the extra frame rate and resolution options, the triple base ISO, all while maintaining really great rolling shutter performance. And you know that this camera with its cooling fan is not going to overheat. I mean, this is a camera that is directly positioned to be used alongside cameras like the Burano or the Venice or Venice 2. Now, where does that leave the rest of the market for Sony in terms of future potential cameras? Well, going back to earlier remarks I made in the podcast that I used for context, I mentioned at the beginning that I had an FS7 and Sony came out with the A7S III and I bought the S3. And I mentioned how the S3 had a better image than the FS7. And ironically, every time I used it, I felt like I wanted to use it over the FS7, even though it wasn't a video, quote unquote, video or cinema camera, just because the image was better. And I did that until Sony finally came out with the FX6, which took the A7S III's sensor and put it in a cinema body. I think that's what we're going to see here. I think they very similarly came out with the FX5. They didn't come out with an A7S. I don't think that camera is going to come back. I think that camera is done with, that series is. And I think this camera is there to not necessarily replace the FX3, but it is there to be the next leap in small form factor cameras for Sony. And I think what you're going to see now is probably toward the end of this year or early next year, we'll probably get something like an FX7 or FX8, and that camera will be above the FX6, and it will have this sensor with all the frame rate and codec and open gate options, but in a cinema or a more proper cinema housed body. Not that the FX5 can't be used in that kind of work. It's just that the FX5 doesn't have things like a locking timecode port or an SDI port or a side grip like the FX6 has. It doesn't have built-in internal NDs. It's got a smaller form factor, so it's going to be harder to bolt a bunch of accessories to. So this camera is not a replacement for an FX6. But like how the A7S III outshot the FS7, this camera is going to outshoot the FX6 in terms of pure capabilities of the image and frame rate and codec options. I mean, you've got a newer sensor. It's got the triple base ISO. It's got higher resolution. It's got higher frame rate options. It's got open gate. It's got X-OCN LT. This is going to outshoot the FX6 in terms of options, dynamic range, probably color because they continue to improve that, and of course, overall codec options. So this is going to be a nicer camera in post to work with than the FX6 is. But it is not a replacement for the FX6 because it's still in more of an FX3 style body. So that's why I think Sony will come out with an FX7 or something like that, probably toward the end of the year or beginning of next year, that will just do what the A7S III to FX6 did. It was take the sensor and everything that it's got on it and put it in a more proper video body. Now, what else does this camera have? It has obviously really great state-of-the-art autofocus. It's got the new battery that debuted with the latest A7R series camera that came out recently. Supposed to improve battery life by like 17% or something like that. It's not a huge deal to me, but it's cool that it has it. It gave it some of the video autofocus features that are in the FX6 that were lacking on like the FX3. For example, the FX6 has this face-only autofocus mode, which is tremendous. It's like face eye only. I actually really like that. Say you're filming an interview, for example, and you have face eye only on. If the subject's face leaves the frame for any reason, or they like to stick their hand in front of their face or anything like that, on a traditional alpha camera, or even the FX3, FX30, FX2, the focus would shift to the hand, or if someone like laughed and ducked out of frame, it would shift to the background. Well, with face eye only, that was in the FX6, and maybe in the FX9, I'm not sure, but I know it was in the FX6 because I use it all the time. Autofocus just stops. It only works if it's detecting a face eye. And that has been a really useful feature for filming things like interviews, or if you're filming, let's say you're filming someone fly fishing on a boat, and the only time you want autofocus is to lock on their face, but you don't want to use autofocus for anything else. We'll just have face eye only on. If their face is in the frame, it's in focus. If it's not in the frame, it goes to manual. You have control. That is a really great feature in the FX6. We now have that in the FX5. Supposedly the screen has been improved. You can add an external EVF, which is cool. I probably won't do that personally, and I'm hinting at whether I'm going to get this camera or not. But I do plan to at some point. We'll get into that in a minute. But when I do think that I will skip the EVF just because I'll probably use this with nothing on a gimbal, or I'll rig it up with a small HD monitor and we'll shoot that way. And I also saw that this camera has been debuted with a new top handle that can do 32-bit float. That's going to be great for people who are shooting YouTube videos or who are doing interviews and stuff off of a boom mic that's cabled, for example, that's going straight into the top handle. If you're listening to this podcast, please keep in mind that 32-bit float will not save your audio from clipping if you overload the mic capsule, right? Every single microphone out there has a max decibel rating. If you blow past that, 32-bit float ain't going to save you. It only saves the file from going over the 0 dB range, but it's not going to save you if you overload the capsule. It's also not going to save you with wireless mics. I can't tell you how many people I talk to or who I see online have this thought process that you don't have to set your gain at all or mess with anything, even with wireless, as long as you have 32-bit float. And that's not true, because you have to still gain stage, because if your transmitter or receiver is overloaded, because you do have to typically set those, then by the time it moves down the chain to the recording, you've already peaked the file and you won't be able to save it. There are a few brands, like I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, I'm pretty sure that Sound Device's new transmitters and receivers actually can be controlled at the receiver end and supposedly can pass on to the recorder a clean file that 32-bit float could help with. I don't have any experience with it. I just read about it. But what I can tell you is this: for like 99.99999% of people out there, if you're using wireless transmitters and receivers, you still have to monitor them and check your gain levels, because you can still overload and peak long before you get to the recording. So I think that when you hear 32-bit float capabilities in this camera and the top handle, keep in mind it's only useful if you have your gain properly set on gain staging with wireless, in which case you're probably not going to peak anyway, or if you have a mic wired directly into the handle, like a wired boom mic with an XLR cable, or maybe a shotgun mic that you're using for capturing scratch audio or nat sound. In that case, the 32-bit float will save you, because you can, if you peak, pull that back. But it has to be directly tethered in for it to really matter. So just keep that in mind. 32-bit float does not automatically mean you can save your peaked audio. That disclaimer out of the way, it is cool that Sony offers that now. So if you are someone who's running a boom mic for interviews and you don't have a sound guy there, you still got to monitor your audio and make sure nothing weird's happening. But if someone laughs or something and peaks it, you can pull it back. Am I going to use that feature? No, I'm not even. I'm going to buy the version of this camera when I do get it that does not have the top handle, because they sell it with and without. I'm going to buy it without. I'll probably never use the top handle. I'll use the FX6 or a future FX7 with a top handle and record my audio into that, or I'll use an external recorder. To me, a camera like the FX5 for my line of work is typically going to be a B cam. I'm going to use it on a gimbal, or I'm going to use it on some sort of a car mount every once in a while, in which case maybe I will get the IBIS removed. We'll see. I'm going to use it as a B camera during interviews where it might be rigged up, etc. But I'm very rarely going to use it as my A camera. Doesn't mean I won't ever. I have used the FX3 as an A camera before. So there might come some times where I use it as an A, but even then I likely don't need the top handle. So I'm going to buy it without it, but it is a cool option that we have now. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of cool things about this camera that make it really unique, that make it different, that improve it upon what the FX3 was. I don't think this necessarily replaces the FX3 just because it is priced at a different pricing tier. It's more expensive. The FX3 market is going to be flooded with used cameras now too. So you'll be able to get into an FX3 probably for a really good price. There's nothing wrong with that camera. Let's lead that into the next part of this, or final part of this discussion, which is whether or not I'll get one. And I do plan to get one at some point, but I'm not in a hurry to. And that is because the FX6 and FX3 I have today are still doing a great job. I've never come home from a project and felt like I was not able to do a good job because of those cameras, because they were like inefficient or unable to do whatever task it was I asked of them. The FX5 is certainly more capable, but I can't say that it's offering anything today that's going to make me more money or change my workflow or the way I work. As mentioned, OpenGate is cool, but I don't think it's something I necessarily have to have all the time. I might use it every once in a while, but it's not that big of a deal to me to where I absolutely have to have it. Same with X-OCN. I am very excited that Sony has put X-OCN in these cameras. But if I'm buying this camera to be used as a B cam, my A cam, the FX6, doesn't even have that. So I'm probably still going to use XAVCI. So everything kind of works together well. So I wouldn't really use X-OCN LT more than likely until an A camera comes out, like an FX7, in which case then I could, because I can have an A and a B that could shoot the same codec. But right now, if I was to buy this camera, the only time I'd use X-OCN LT until something like that comes out would be for a high dynamic range situation. Speaking of, it does have a dual gain output mode that does help you squeeze out more dynamic range, which is really cool. Has some limitations, like every camera that has it, but it is back to like very similar to the OpenGate. The dual gain output in this camera is way less limited than it is on other cameras. So it is less of a gimmick and more of an actual usable feature, just like OpenGate is. So that is really cool. So if I was to use this camera for X-OCN or dual gain output, it would be for a very specific shot. Otherwise, I would stick with XAVCI until I had a matching A cam, in which case then maybe I would shoot everything X-OCN LT, or not everything, but a lot of things. But until an A cam that has that same feature comes out, I would just stick with XAVCI. Is the 5K great? Yes, I would love to have that, but it's not going to make or break my shoots today. Typically in the past, when I upgrade cameras, I'm usually doing it because I'm solving a problem. And the truth is that with the FX6 and the FX3, I just really don't have any major problems to solve. Are they perfect? No. Is this camera better? Yes, in many ways. But I'm not looking at my work today and thinking to myself, man, if only I had X-OCN LT here. Man, if only I had OpenGate, or if only I had 5K or those extra frame rates. Like that's not the case. No client of mine is going to pay me more because I have this camera. So it's not going to make me any additional income. I'm not going to get hired, I don't think, just because I have it either. So for me, if I were to buy this camera, I'd be buying it for me because I want to have X-OCN LT, or I want to have OpenGate, or I want to have the higher frame rate or resolution options. And so from a business standpoint, when you take the emotion out of it and you look at it purely from a business investment, I think that this is a camera I would like to get at some point, but I'm not planning to buy today because I do not think it will help me make any additional revenue. And so for me to buy it, I'm going to wait until I have excess income. We have a lot, like maybe we'll be in a situation we have a lot of jobs lined up and I've got a little cash to burn. Maybe at that point I'll buy one. But as of today, I'm not going to grab it just yet. I do think I will end up with it at some point though, which is why earlier I made some comments about me getting it at some point. So I do think I will eventually. I'm just not in a hurry to get it right now because the FX6 and FX3 are still so good. And that's why I said, when you look at the video market and you look at like Canon, for example, yeah, they have come out with some compelling cameras over the last 2 or 3 years that have outpaced Sony, which they should have. They're newer. But Sony's FX3 and FX6 were so daggum good when they came out that all these years later, I still don't have a major reason to get rid of them. In fact, I don't plan to get rid of them. When I do grab an FX5 and an FX7 whenever it comes out, I still plan to keep and use the FX6 and FX3 as extra cameras at my work, whether it's extra live stream angles or extra cameras for interviews, or maybe to send a crew out on a job and send them a whole nother kit. They're great. They've been paid for over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. They basically print me money at this point. So I do not plan on getting rid of them at any point, and I certainly don't plan on adding an FX6 right now or FX5 right now either, because I just can't justify it. But I think at some point I will, just whenever I have extra cash to burn. Now, you might be in a different position. Maybe you already have that extra cash to burn, or maybe you have a very specific need for OpenGate, for example. Maybe you do a ton of work where you're shooting horizontal but also need vertical. It might make sense for you. But for me, in my line of work, in the things that I'm doing today, I'm excited to get one. I'm just not in a hurry to. So those are my thoughts on the FX5. I think it's a tremendous offering from Sony. It shows where their head's at. It shows that the future is extremely bright. And I'm very excited to see what they come out with next that will leapfrog the FX6, especially since the FX9 has been discontinued for a little while now, because we have a major gap now between the FX6, FX5, and the Burano. Something's got to give. I'm excited to see what that is. And the future's telling us, Sony's telling us that the future's bright and that they're going to give us OpenGate and higher resolution and frame rate options and 16-bit internal RAW with whatever they come out with next, which is fantastic. I think Sony is solidifying their place as the leader in the video market with this camera, and I'm excited to see what the future holds from here. What are your thoughts on the FX5? Go to Filming with Josh, ask to join the group, and comment on the post of this podcast. Let me know. Or go to Rustic River Media on Instagram or on Facebook, comment there, or shoot me an email at josh@rusticriver.media. Let me know what you're planning to do. Are you going to buy an FX5? Why or why not? Let's chat. Thanks, guys, for listening to another episode. I can't wait to chat with you next time. Take care.
To learn more about Rustic River Media, visit us online at rusticriver.media. Thanks for listening to the Filming with Josh podcast. Catch every episode by hitting subscribe today.